So, hello again. Here we are in the second part of day one of the conference. I have here with me the Decolonising Psychiatry, Mental Health in Conflict Zones panel. And I'm really happy to welcome Lamia Moghnieh, Reima Maglajlić, and Donato Zupin, who will show up online soon. And then a huge, huge thanks to also Aouefa for taking this task and moderating this not very easy panel. I will just introduce Aouefa shortly, and then I will give the floor to you. So Aouefa Amoussouvi, she's a researcher at the Institute for Endotic Research here. She's from France / Germany, lives in Germany. So she's also, French Beninese multidisciplinary researcher, artist and curator based in Berlin. She holds a PhD in theoretical molecular biophysics, but it's also a co-director of the Institute for Endotic Research. So her work explores rituals, technologies, intersectional and decolonial feminist narratives in science, and aims to create practices for collective knowledge production outside Western and academic context. She also investigates technologies for healing and maintenance of transgenerational memories and is currently training in process-oriented psychology. We've spoken quite a lot about this panel, so I think I can safely leave the floor to you.
First I would like to thank Elena for the nice introduction. I would like to welcome the people who join us within the break, in person and online. And I would like also to thank for the trust of giving me the moderation of the panel. So the panel name is Decolonising Psychiatry. I talked a lot with Elena about the title, and for us it was important to acknowledge that decolonizing can have a very broad meaning. Here in this panel, we want to acknowledge the fact that we want to acknowledge the role of the colonial agenda in the making of psychiatry as an academic, as a scientific field. We also want to acknowledge the fact that we want to acknowledge the fact of this, the making of this science has been used to, in the colonial characterization of non-Western society, their culture, their belief system, and it has been also their healing methodologies has been seen as inferior in comparison with the Western Eurocentric knowledge system. And this back few hundred of years. And if we want to decolonize psychiatry, we have first to acknowledge the colonial history of psychiatry, and we have to recognize that still nowadays there is the psychiatry as we know is mainly not including, I will check my notes, it's mainly not including other culture, other belief system, other therapy or healing methods that are not Western. And because of this, it's also challenging within the Eurocentric Western system to acknowledge, to address the racial discrimination, and also to provide care and therapy in cross-cultural setting. Today in this panel we will hear 3 talks, and we will discuss the challenging of decolonizing the Western and Eurocentric psychiatry, focusing in the specificity of conflict zones. We will talk about the challenges of giving care to survivors of a conflict zone within the conflict zone, but also outside. We will also talk about the different strategy of survivals and the different structure of support that has been built within those conflict zones. Elena already named the speaker of tonight. I will say a little bit more about them. So we will first hear from Reima Maglajlić. Sorry. Maglajlić. Yes. And Reima will talk on the distress caused by the political conflicts, and especially the one in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We will then hear from Donato Zupin, who is online from Trieste in Italy. And Donato will address the systemic racism against migrant ethnic minority groups in psychiatric institutions, focusing on his local perspective of Trieste in Italy. And finally, we will hear from Lamia Moghnieh. And Lamia will talk about the politics of trauma, grief, and resilience in Lebanon and other Middle Eastern and North African countries. So I would like first to give a little longer introduction about our first speaker, Reima. Reima is currently working as a reader in social work at the University of Sussex and serves as a co-director of the British Journal of Social Work. Over the past 20 years, Reima has supported different initiatives developed in collaboration with people who experience distress due to the political conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina. This includes both the development of associations for mutual support in mental distress in this country, as well as co-production of knowledge about the very experience of distress caused by the political conflict, and to assess the effectiveness of community-based mental health services in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Finally, in parallel of all of this, Reima also worked as a consultant on the reform of health and social care services across Southeast Europe. Reima, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. In preparation, just to explain the attire a little bit, which some of you may have noticed. So, hi, my name is Reima. There is only one country in which my name and surname is pronounced properly, and that's Bosnia and Herzegovina, and that is not a country of my birth. So I'm quite used to kind of going Reima Maglajlić. I'm going to be, so in preparation, I was wondering whether to experiment with different form of presenting and sharing with you some of the topics, and I'm wearing some of them, and I'm happy for you to approach and look around. I'm going to be least talking about community-based services, which I'm literally sitting on at the moment, and I will continue to sit on them substantially as we go through. But I do also have some visuals. I also have to have 2 disclaimers for you. First one is, I will show you some images because we are talking about experiencing war. And it's a difficult topic, and I will try to show some of the experience without showing you too many gory details, but some of the portrayals about how people feel and what they have experienced. They may be distressing to some and I apologize in advance. I'll keep them very briefly, and they are solely for the purpose of telling a story. The second part is I'm a middle-aged woman who feels her feels very strongly. I get moved about everything, but particularly so about topics which are important to me. So my voice may start to quiver, and I may take a deep breath, but continue to speak nonetheless. It is just part of my my journey, let's say. So the colors here, they're actually not Ukrainian, although the yellow may not be coming through very strongly. They're actually colors of the Bosnian flag, and they're also very, very strong. And this is the topic of, about which I'm talking. It's based not just on my work, but work of others who are one of other person, China Mills, is going to be talking to you tomorrow. But also Halida Vejsegic, who is the Bosnian researcher I work with, and Yasmin Palata, who is now an independent researcher and activist based in Tuzla, and both of them are based in Bosnia and Herzegovina. There is a language barrier, which I have tried to overcome many times over 25 years, but English has still not become an easy medium for many. So I'm spokesperson here, but they are spokespeople in other countries about the work that we do, particularly regionally. And this is a joint arrangement rather than one selected by me, and it feels important to kind of say that. So just to give you some background and context, and yeah, I mentioned that some of the things that I may show you might not necessarily be easy to see. So all of this started being an important, and what we are talking about here, and Lamia and I had a bit of a catch-up, we are talking about our experience, and the kind of epistemic injustice which happens in relation to that is twofold, as I will tell you about a bit later. But it's related to the experiences which for me happened first in my country of my birth, where I'm a minority kind of Serb, Croatian, and with a Bosnian father. The war there in that country started in 91 and continued until end of 95. And sorry, I dropped the mic talking, focusing more on what I was saying rather than everybody hearing me. Thank you. And war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which started in 92 and to 96, which is a lot, it's 30 years ago. And all these experiences at best walk alongside us for the rest of our days, and quite frequently hold us in a sumo grip on the floor for a prolonged period of times. And another part of it is who gets to tell the story of the war, and that is not an easy one, because it involves conflict and different versions of the same story being told. And we have similar situations in different power differentials and struggles in a variety of ways. And they are linked to about who says something about the war. And when thinking about which image to choose, I came back to an image which I actually facilitated. I was there when it was created, and it was created in '93. On Croatian coast by Jana, who was a refugee from Brčko in northeast Bosnia and Herzegovina. And kids were asked, she was 12 years old at the time, and kids were asked to draw. It's a whole different story, which I can tell you in the break if you want to hear it. Kids were asked to draw about what their life is like and what they dream of their life being. And Jana drew this monk-like portrayal of war that she experienced in her hometown, and the title of it was I Was Born to Suffer. And there are many Janas of this world that we spoke to later on during the research I will tell you more about, but it's a very powerful portrayal. I was 21 at the time, and I remember spending a long time just looking at this particular drawing and how powerful it was in portraying what people experienced and how they feel about political conflict, because there are tears. She's just become this emotion, and there are tears streaming down her face, and her heart is broken. The second image is slightly lighter and flips to kind of what else I talk about. And I love this image because it shows, it's a cartoon from New York Times, I think, and it shows two barbarians and a professor of barbarian studies kind of riding behind with a pipe, white, male, middle-aged, let's say. And that is a frequent kind of, a lot of research which is created about war and about madness is done by somebody who doesn't have the first-hand experience, who has an interest, who is a subject specialist, but not necessarily has that experience themselves. So when we talk about war, I'm not talking about some interest in another context. I'm talking also about experience of myself very lightly, but also of my peers. And then I was asked to mention briefly about what happened in relation to professional responses, but I don't want to focus on it too much. So this is Bosnia and Herzegovina, if you haven't never seen the map. It's divided and joined into 13 entities after the 1996 Dayton Peace Accords. That means 13 layers of governance, for example, which have to legislate for health and social care, which kind of is adjacent to everything we're talking about today. And one of the things that happened, which was a good outcome, so Bosnia didn't have a long it did have form part of the Austro-Hungarian tradition of large-scale institutions, but in Bosnia and Herzegovina they weren't as big as they are in neighboring Serbia and Croatia. But there were, and still are, unfortunately, large-ish psychiatric hospitals, which were bombed, which is one way to initiate a reform. Unfortunately, with no people in them. What happened at the time is a kind of set of coincidences. Main one being that at that time, the Bosnia and Herzegovina World Health Organization office was staffed by Italians, and who, when asked to rebuild institutions, which was a fashion at the time in the late 90s still, decided not to do that and said, how about we do something in the community? So that is what was supported then by European Union with their funding. And this is a kind of, it's called New Sarajevo, and it's a very, I've seen even some buildings in the neighborhood resembling that. And one of those buildings, apart from housing a lot of people in kind of neighborhoods built after the, in kind of late 50s, early 60s, and throughout onwards towards the 80s, one of these buildings is a community primary healthcare center. And within it is a community mental health center staffed by a psychiatrist, a psychologist, part-time social worker, and 4 nurses on paper, not always in practice. And people receive talking therapies, they have drop-ins, they kind of have space to socialize. Psychiatrists were encouraged not to wear white coats or white overalls, and to spend time supporting people within the community without long waiting lists and being able to talk to people about what's happening. And very importantly, involving kind of spending time talking over a coffee and a cigarette, which are very important parts of how we spend and communicate and talk to each other about anything that matters. In parallel, unfortunately, there are still large-scale hospitals, about which can take up to 300 people, and which conditions have been mentioned by Jasna and by Colin, our keynote speakers, in terms of what kind of conditions they might be. And crucially, they also exist in the social care sector. In parallel to that, there was an emergence, and I supported the development some 22 years ago of alternatives to that, which were people who experienced distress during the political conflict, whether as soldiers or as civilians, and they would call themselves initiatives for mutual support in mental distress. And this shows Phoenix in Tuzla. They also would offer drop-ins and training and support, and still do. Those that exist, many of them disbanded. There are new ones emerging. Sometimes there are collaboration between professionals and people who have experienced distress. Some of them have land where people are able to both make their own food, but also make money producing food, which is very, very important to them. And then we come to kind of who gets to produce knowledge about these experiences, particularly focusing on distress, but war in general as well. And one thing which I found only recently is that Imperial War Museum from London has sent their artist, Peter Howell, to be the official war artist in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Peter is Scottish. He's an amazing artist, and he really took to heart the experiences that people shared with him, including use of rape as a weapon of war. And he painted it. And this painting, which I'll very briefly show you, which shows an act of rape, and it's called Croats and Bosniaks, was banned, which had a massive impact on him and his chance to kind of speak about those experiences. But when I saw that image, I didn't think about that, but I thought, why didn't they invite Bosnian artists who are making art about our experiences to show what we experienced and how we want to portray it? And this is by an artist called Sheila Kameric, who I really want you to look up because she's an amazing artist. And this is called Bosnian Girl. The words that she projected onto herself, much like I've projected words that we found on myself, are from a graffiti which Dutch soldiers showed in Srebrenica, and this was their comment on who the Bosnian girls are. We try to do something different, which is to initiate a collaboration and address it by initiating a collaboration throughout the research process. So working alongside people who have experienced distress in political conflict and alongside China as our critical friend. We were involved together in preparing a bid to get some funding for it, in creating how we're going to do the research. It was also very much a response to work Halida and I did previously, which was to focus on services, on community mental health services. So all the talk we did to people was, how do you feel about community mental health centers? What works well about them? How can they be improved? Instead of what happened to you? And that is what we wanted to talk to people about. We also jointly tried to make sense of the stories that people shared with us and how to promote them. So there were two studies in parallel. One was funded by the Independent Social Research Foundation and the current one by the British Academy. And these studies, in the first one, we talked to 10 people in Tuzla in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the northeast of the country, and in the capital of Sarajevo, about their experiences, about what happened to them, what they find supports their distress and helps address it, and what really doesn't help. And then, based on that, I said, Halida, there was this funding, do you want to do something? And she went, yes. And she literally told me, I want to go to this many places, I want to talk to these people, and this time I don't want to talk, because we had kind of half women, half men. They were mainly Bosniak. In the second study, she went, I want to go to rural areas, because that's another thing that we didn't manage to do. I want to talk to people who are of different ethnicities. I want to make sure I also talk to Roma people, and I want to talk to people about any other health issues that they might have. So we managed to get funding to do that. And I'll tell you now very briefly about the findings. The key finding is that people wanted to be heard. They wanted to take part in the study, to tell their stories, and they would really want to hear other people's stories, to have a chance to tell you their story. And if you want to kind of find out more, there is a full report that we created, includes all of the narratives we have created, and we want to create something like People of New York page going forward, where because people really want their stories to be heard and shared. The second thing is that despite the fact that people would talk about PTSD and different labels, and that they would kind of that would be the first step. This is what doctors say happened to me. But when they would kind of put that to one side, they all could say what made them distress. And it wasn't their biology, it was what happened to them. It was the violence they experienced, either as soldiers or as civilians, or for women, gender-based violence that they experienced. Also, the impact of poverty, ongoing poverty, and witnessing injustice and nepotism in Bosnian and Herzegovina society. That is what caused their distress, not who they are, but the experiences that they have had. What's important for them is mutual relationships. So yes, community-based services are great, and they're very supportive, and it's great to have someone to talk to, but it's also starting a family, which happens to men a bit more than women, having friends, and being able to choose and do things that you like, whether it's something around your home or in the community or going fishing, and having these mutual relationships, being somebody's friend, somebody's spouse, somebody's parent, those things are important. Very important also is having a chance to talk to people who have experienced the same issues that you have experienced, and having survivor-run initiatives, people who have been through similar experiences, and having a chance to talk to each other and saying, "Is it just me?" And being able to explore different ways that life impacts on us, and particularly if you're marginalized, if you feel like you don't have much voice and say in your life. Which brings us to the next topic, which is importance of protecting self-determination. Big issue for this conference is madness and social justice, and it's hugely, hugely important. And another thing which is being eroded from societies is access to legal remedies, to advocacy, and it's hugely important for people to, someone to be in their corner and to help them have a say and have agency about what happens to them. So, in summary, although this is very hard, and I'll speak from memory because I can't read it this far, but the key kind of implication is that are coming through for our study is that when we're talking about, and there were interesting discussions in the keynote about paid and unpaid roles, and I think that plight with professionals is we get paid for this type of work. And who has access to means to live and live a socially just life. It's important to have that basic sense of security, that you have enough means in your life, so whether it's through benefit system or access to employment, and different people have different views on this, but everyone feeling safe, that they can have a roof over their head, that they can protect themselves, that they can have some means to enjoy art and enjoy some nicer things in life. Importance of having access to advocacy and legal remedies if your rights are being breached, and that being available and having an awareness of that. Much more important potentially in some situations than other paid professional help. And importance of survivor initiatives are very, very important. If there are professional mental health initiatives, the important ones are not coercive. All the bad experiences happen where people experience coercive treatments. And you may also notice that these findings are not very different from those of which people who have experienced distress in non-war contexts are saying. We all want the same socially just lives to be lived. I'll stop there.
I will ask you to write down your question or to keep them in a small corner of your mind. We will move on to the next speaker, Donato Zupin, joining us online. Donato is a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist. He's currently based in the city of Trieste in Italy, where Franco Basaglia famously kick-started the deinstitutionalization process in the 70s. Up until today, Trieste is known for being a lab for radical deinstitutionalization processes through a freedom-first, social rights-based approach to mental disorder. The city is also a key point of the Balkan route and hosts some of the strongest anti-migrant political movements. In this context, full of cultural contradictions, Donato is the coordinator of the working group on migrants of the Department of Mental Health of the World Health Organization Collaborative Centers. He is a nominated advisor for the board of directors of the World Association of Cultural Psychiatry, and he acts as a president for the Transcultural Psychiatry Special Section within the Italian Society of Psychiatry. Finally, Donato is associate editor of the Italian Journal of Cultural Psychiatry and Psychotherapy. I'm looking forward to hear your contribution.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much also to the other panelists for introducing the topics of systemic racism and involuntary treatment and self-determination. This makes my task much easier because what I'm trying to do with you this evening is I want to give you a glance of what happened behind the scenes. How is it possible that there is such an important systemic racism in mental health? I entitled my talk of this evening "A Split Society in Treatment" because the main point of my hypothesis is that the problem lies within psychiatry and within the hosting society's culture. This is important as a suggestion because usually the traditional paradigm is to consider the mental health service user's culture. Like there is something good or not good in his or her culture. While if we take another approach, we can consider the mental health provider's culture. And as I said, the hosting society culture, the relationship between these three things. In this sense, we can think to culture not as something that a patient have, but it's kind of an environment in which human relationships take place. And so culture is the environment in which everybody lives, and thus the suffering and the healing take place in this environment. For this reason, maybe it could be a good idea if I give you a glance of what is the professional subculture to which I belong. And as Aouefa said, I work and live in Trieste. It is a very small city, it's nearly 200,000 people, but it has a relevance for Italian psychiatry. You can Google it, Trieste mental health. For sure you will see something peculiar, because it is considered to be a radical deinstitutionalization experience. This means that the system, the mental health system here is freedom first and social right based. And in daily life, that means that we have no psychiatric hospital at all. This concerns all Italy. And specifically in the city where I work, we not go to the bed. We do not use physical restraint in any case. This is very important, and we don't lock people into the room, even in the most severe form of breakdown. And we do not use electroconvulsive. The detention rate, as far as I know, is the lowest in the West. As you know, detention is the hardest form of psychiatric treatment. Is when the authorities gives the doctor the permission to use the force with the police to take somebody and hold her or him in a psychiatric facility and give him or her medicine against her or his will. What we do instead is that the biggest part of the treatment happen in community mental health services, and most of the community mental health services is 24/7. We have only a small psychiatric ward that is located in the general hospital. It accounts for just a portion of the so-called inpatient stay, because most of the inpatient stay happens in the community mental health center. And still, in the psychiatric ward in the general hospital, the door is always open in and out, even in the case of involuntary treatment. Another important part of this subculture, as I said, that housing and job placement are considered to be part of the therapy. So, how can a mental health system like that can interact with the systemic discrimination that we know is alive and well in science, medicine, psychiatry, and in the whole society? I'll try to give an example that really happened in Trieste, in which the stereotypes of the good migrants played a role, and a negative one. So my point is that the stereotypes of the good migrants are important part of systemic racism. We're talking about men, middle-aged men. Let's say that his name is Hamad Popescu. It's a fake name, of course, to safeguard his privacy. The name seems like it was from Maghreb, and the surname seems like it was from East Europe. He was homeless, and he was spending most of his days wandering around in the place in front of the railway station, displaying an overtly frenzy behavior and delusional state. This was pretty clear to everybody. And so a general alarm started to begin about Hamad Popescu, also because he had some issue with alcohol and legal substances. Seems to be undocumented migrants, but we never really know because he always refused to say his identity, his national identity, or his citizenship, and he never showed any documents. So it was, a kind of impression. Everybody has the impression that he was irregular migrants. As you can imagine, Hamad didn't come to me for psychiatric treatment, but we in the mental health department, we came to know of his existence because one humanitarian organization that we'll call Salvation Army did a very clear request to the psychiatric institution. They said you have to detain him. This is from scratch. They threatened to take legal action against the mental health department if we didn't detain Hamad. And of course, we didn't like the kind of request. I was feeling very uncomfortable for the reason that you can imagine. And so we took time and we started talking with them. So if you're doing the request, you the humanitarian NGO, what's up to you? What do you think? So we talked a lot with them, and I had the feeling that there was this kind of underpinnings, this kind of assumption they had, that I can say in this way. They asked for detention because originally they think something like migrants are good people and migrants are people who suffered, and therefore they suffer now, therefore they need help. Help that Hamad doesn't want, but we know better. He needs help. We know the most good for him. So you doctor from the MHD, you have to detain him. At the beginning, we refused, and so they became more and more concerned about the situation, and to have this result to make us detain Hamad, they start to lobby on one political party that, let's say, for example, that it was the Democratic Party. So while we were saying we cannot detain people that we didn't even speak with, we want to speak with him and we wanted to know what does he wants. In that moment, the humanitarian NGO lobbied, pushed on the one political party that became afraid that something very bad will happen if we don't detain Ahmad. And they started to lobby on the mental health department, asking for detention. They were asking for detention too. So we took some time to speak with them and understand their feelings and their thoughts. And in this sense, we had the feeling that they had the stereotypes of the black man, the dangerous black man in mind. But at the end of the day, it was much easier because when we get to talk with Ahmad, we offer the shelter that he's refused. We offer psychological support that he refused, but he nicely and politely asked for an antipsychotic, which we prescribed, and he steadily improved. So in all this buzz, in all this confusion that you can see here on the slide, this is the easiest part. While what I'm proposing is that part of the pathology lies here in the confusion in the community and in the suffering in the community generated by the Western stereotypes on migrants. The stereotypes of the bad migrants, the stereotypes of the good migrants, which are kind of actually shared images that can be embedded in different organizations. So one of the ideas that I'd like to discuss with you is how can we treat this if this is pathology? So at the end of the day, my suggestion is that pathology could lie here in the relationship between the culture of the providers and the hosting society's culture, and in some cases, at least, it has nothing to do with the user's culture. But the fact that the culture, the users is a migrant is only a spark that brings up this problem between our society. Finally, I think that if we are to decolonize the psychiatry, we need another way of thinking and another kind of language. And in that sense, I really hope that I can that this book will be translated in English, because it's one of the best examples that I had. And if you read it, it seems like fairy tales. It seems it has nothing to do with mental health. But I had feelings that here you can find a way to think about the relationship between culture and the mental health system that can bring us a step closer to another way of carry out mental health for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Donato. I will ask the audience again to write down the question or keep them for the after the discussion after the next and last talk. The next talk is by Lamia Moghnieh. Lamia is a mental health practitioner and a medical anthropologist. Her investigation looks at the impact of psychiatry on the social understandings, both on a self level and a global level, mostly focusing on the post-colonial and post-conflict societies. She is part of the ethnography and knowledge in the Arab region working group, as well as currently a postdoctoral fellow in the research project Decolonizing Madness at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark. Her manuscript, entitled Psychiatric Afterlives, Narrative Illness, Gender and Violence in Lebanon, offers a new history of psychiatry and public life in Lebanon that critically engages with the voices and of patients and therapeutic communities since the 30s to the present day. I'm looking forward, Lamia, to hear your talk.
Thank you so much for this lovely panel and for the panelists before me. I'm really, really cold, so I'm trembling, but it's because I'm just a bit cold and I don't want to wear my coat because I want to look cute when I'm talking. So I'm a bit vain, so there will be some trembling involved. So I'm a social worker, a therapist, and an anthropologist, and I'm also a patient of therapy myself. And throughout this talk, I will try to speak from all of these positions together. So as a researcher, as a practitioner, but in a more intimate, vulnerable place, as also as a patient myself. Slide 2. Okay. So I work in the field of mental health, and I do research on the histories and ethnographies of psychiatry. I follow the discourses of mental health in the Middle East and North Africa, in the MENA region, or otherwise known as SWANA, Southwest West Asia and North Africa, and I'm from Lebanon myself. And I'm a researcher at the Decolonizing Madness project at the University of Copenhagen. The project is very much a transdisciplinary project. It includes historians, anthropologists, practitioners, and it investigates the less told story of the decolonization of psychiatry in the Global South, so in the Global South and Eastern Europe. We work from India, from Latin America, and from the Middle East and North Africa. And we look at the different ways in which practitioners from the Global South sought to reconfigure and rethink psychiatry, therapy, but also therapeutic notions such as the psyche, the self, illness, but more problematic ones, as we saw in the previous panel, problematic notions such as culture, religion, and how they are used in psychiatry. So we look at the ways in which people experimented with these things, rethought with them, manipulated them in different ways, contested them in different ways, and sort of try to push away psychiatry from its colonial roots and into new kinds of politics, new kinds of environmental. I mean, of course, there's always power with psychiatry, but how there was a shift in power in these kinds of circumstances. So, of course, this topic has practical information, and it's not just research. It has practical information on people's lives and on the ways in which we all heal, but also the ways in which we are expected to heal from different institutions, as we've heard so well and so painfully from the panel before us. So we can think of psychiatric institutions and how they force us to heal in certain ways or define what healing is for us. We can also think of state institutions and how they expect certain kinds of citizens to act, to be normal, to be normative in certain ways. We can think of patriarchy, patriarchal institutions, and how they push us to also be normal and to be to heal and recover and to be in a certain way. And we can also think of humanitarianism and how they also govern the bodies of refugees and force a specific kind of recovery and specific forms of healings in particular ways. And of course, corporations and how we are forced to be these labored bodies, productive bodies, especially today in so many crises we live in. In this sense, our project, the Decolonizing Madness project, invites a return to different historical moments from the Global South and Eastern Europe, where these things were challenged, contested, rethought, as a way to radically reimagine the status of global mental health today. And as my colleague said in the panel before us, not to reform, not to rehabilitate what we already have, but to radically reimagine. I think this is what this panel is also trying to think about. Of course, it's obvious that this is crucial today as we are in a severe crisis in terms of mental health, but also in terms of how we are expected to heal and how we are expected to be normative and normal. So my research in this project has primarily focused on tracing these initiatives in the MENA region, as psychiatry came under the post-colonial Arab nation state. And it's, of course, colonialism did not end when we say colonial and post-colonial. So all of these are, I mean, as again, the panel before us has shown, these are all things, but as you have shown as well, post-coloniality is about questioning, is about posing the questions of things that are already still happening in terms of the relationship between race, culture, and illness. And I will also talk about a little bit about gender as well. So I'm interested in the various kinds of debates. So the ways in which people debate mental health and mental illness, like psychiatrists, our practitioners in general, sociologists, journalists, public health officials, the police, humanitarian workers, artists, authors, patients. I focus a lot on patients and family members, and the way their own voices as well. And I look at, my research is archival and ethnographic. So archivally, I look at the patient records of mental health hospitals, like the Lebanon Hospital for Mental and Nervous Disorders, and also Al-Razi Hospital in Tunisia, which Fanon actually worked there for a month. And there's a very funny story about that, but we can have a drink and I can tell you about it if you want. But I focus on specifically here in the women patients who were chronically institutionalized in these hospitals, and how these women slipped into institutionalization. So what makes someone be chronically institutionalized and remain there for the rest of their lives? And I take on, central in my work is the relationship between gender and psychiatry, because I think this relationship in the MENA region and in any kind of region, honestly, can show us something interesting, as race does, as class does, but it can show us something intimate and interesting on public imaginaries, how people also imagine madness and the power of psychiatry. So the ways in which psychiatry governs sexuality, masculinities, femininities, non-normative people, and women. So one of the debates on mental health that I've been researching since I was a PhD is, of course, around, since I've been living in Lebanon, honestly, also, is, of course, on trauma, violence, and recovery. Trauma has become this concept that has defined our shared humanity. So the idea that everyone gets traumatized from war, and the humanity is very vulnerable, is precarious self that encounters violence and is injured by it. So it is about this human also who always encounters violence. It's not the assumption that we are constantly living in microaggressions and violence. And this is in this definition of trauma itself. In the era of injury politics, also trauma is taking on new meanings and new political claims and moral claims today. So in the MENA region, the language of trauma has been both appropriated as political, but also contested as being very apolitical by various groups and communities as they sought to redefine, find claim and justice, understand and heal from their suffering. Whether it was defined by psychiatry and humanitarianism as PTSD and post-traumatic stress disorder, or evoked in public culture as meaning many different things, trauma is an elusive thing that has taken on many material, bureaucratic, political, and healing meanings for different communities and individuals alike. In that sense, institutional, so how the state thinks about trauma, or humanitarianism and psychiatry, so institutional narratives on trauma and communal narratives do not always converge. We do not always mean the same thing when we're talking about trauma. Conversations on trauma in the MENA region have been entangled with broader questions and inquiries on the politics of suffering, how we articulate our sufferings, to whom we articulate it, and why. And it has honestly been extremely ideologized as well. And it's a question on how do we live and continue to live in a violent, unequal, and dwindling world. In Egypt, trauma has meant a lot for activists and feminists as they struggle to cope with post-revolutionary oppression. The work produced by Egyptian feminists recording experiences of violence against women and victims of torture has relocated trauma into the center of Egyptian politics as a wound that denounces state and masculine violence. In Syria, new platforms emerged for much-needed personal writings, reflections, and intellectualization, trying to make sense of, that's what I mean, over how we experience unfathomable and repetitive state violence, trauma, and how do we remember it. In Europe, or the Middle East in relation to Europe, trauma has meant something as a bureaucratic thing. It has meant a visa, a kind of a bureaucratic paper that proves to Europeans that the person is not a perpetrator of violence, but a victim and therefore worthy to access to enter Europe. And second, once refugees are in Europe, trauma is directly seen as a security threat. Traumatized bodies of refugees is an urgent matter because refugees can enact this violence, can teach it to their children, and therefore healing and therapy is an urgent matter. Not to heal, but to build these sort of or integrate these bodies into European society. And here we can also think of the extensive interest and scrutinizations that by European and UK states in monitoring the children and the teenagers of refugees themselves as sort of, perpetrating the fear that they also carry this kind of violence themselves. And here I refer also to Colin talking about over-researched populations, and of course refugees and migrants for generations and generations are also over-researched, over-scrutinized, they are over-scrutinized bodies. In Lebanon and also in Palestine, to an extent, the story narrative on trauma from Israeli war, occupation, and settler colonialism has been in many ways a story of absence. So while the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982, the first war, was one of the wars that helped further validate the diagnosis of PTSD within the DSM-3, only by focusing on the psychic casualties from the Israeli side, so from the Israeli soldiers themselves. In Lebanon, psychiatrists have always struggled to find and treat traumatized communities and to find trauma. And this happens in 1982, in 1996, and in 2006, July war with the repetitive sort of violence. So I will give one example of this trauma absence, which is a recurrent thing, but I will not read the quote, or else we will not, I will take too much time. But in 1982, following the Israeli invasion and also the Sabra and Satila massacre, the WHO has asked for Mansell Patterson, the American psychiatrist, to come and run an assessment of the population. And Mansell Patterson did not find any traumatized communities. On the contrary, he found like people who were cheerful, energetic, enthusiastic. It was really hard to find trauma. And this is a recurrent story that I find in my research that I'm very much interested about. What does it mean not to have a trauma from war in Lebanon, whereas in Israel you have abundance of PTSD, intergenerational trauma from soldiers, from civilians, etc., etc. So I'm interested in following what this means within Lebanese communities. In terms of how was this absence of trauma debated, and what is the implication on suffering when we don't find trauma? Then how do people suffer? What is the implication when my suffering or our suffering is not legible in these kind of categories? It's completely unrecognizable or unattended to. So the debates have been I've summarized them in 3 points. First, the absence was claimed directly as the concept of sumud, and it's a Palestinian concept that has to do with political resistance and steadfastness in the face of occupation and resistance to Israeli occupation and an unjust war. Yet, this has created in Lebanon, yes, 5 minutes is perfect. It has created in Lebanon a sort of a binary, whereas either you subscribe to this category of trauma by psychiatry and humanitarianism, or you are read directly as a resilient person. Suffering and articulations of suffering that don't fall within these two are not at all legible. And then it shows how suffering can be very politicized, but ideologized in a way where it cannot be articulated anymore within these two frameworks. Second, there was always a discussion about modernity. So there were discussions between political actors, psychiatrists, and public health officials in Lebanon about how this denotes a sort of a non-modern way, a sort of a pre-modern way of suffering. If you're not traumatized, then you are a bit uncivilized. And this has also religion, as also Colin mentioned religion, so was also seen as something that is prohibiting people from suffering in the appropriate way, which is trauma. The third one, also from Global Mental Health in Post-War Reform Lebanon, was thinking of culture again as a barrier to suffering. So culture became the cause of this trauma absence, and people were seen as resistant to therapy, and they need to overcome this resistance. So there are all these reforms in society too, and I think Reima is familiar with these things. So concluding reflections, my work has invited a moving away from the trauma binary, trauma resilience binary that is also exists in the psychological literature as well, towards more understanding the politics of suffering and the infrastructures of suffering. So also the militarization, the military meaning behind trauma and resilience during war, but also the political meaning, the moral meaning, the economic meaning, all these kinds of infrastructural things that also defines our suffering. Therefore, suffering is not just this psychic private thing, it's very much a political thing. If we want to think about recovery and healing, then we have to understand all this infrastructure in order to actually recover and heal. The second point I have is that trauma discourses shift and change. And the Beirut port explosion in 2020 has completely also challenged this trauma and resilience binary, where Lebanese have been fed up by this also resilience discourse that is co-opted and used by the state itself, so that doesn't have to see people suffering. And there's a new sort of, trauma has meant something new, and it has meant something quite powerful, and as a way to accuse the state of its negligence and of its violence. The third point that I have absolutely no time to talk about, but maybe in the discussion, it's a sort of a big inspiration of mine, which is Octavia Butler's work, who is a science fiction Black feminist writer, and has really influenced my work in terms of moving away from this idea of trauma and to being stuck in arguing whether I am traumatized or I am resilient, and moving away to thinking more about ways in which we are surviving, ways in which we are recovering, in which we are adapting, which is a lot in her work. As it's my way to think about, a new way to think about healing and recovery that is on a communal level, but also individual level, but it has to do also with how we are living in continuous violence, but also surviving it. And what kind of tools do we use to survive from it, and how can we share these tools, and how can we also focus perhaps also on that? Thank you.
I think from the audience and as myself, I would like to thank you, you three, very much for your contribution. I have the privilege to start asking the first question. And my first question goes to Reima. I'm thinking that in your presentation, you presented a process that is probably like 20 or 30 years old.
the conflict started 30 years ago.
Yeah.
The research processes I just refer to, we've only been doing it for about 3 years now. But we've done some it builds on similar work that I've done on different topics. A lot of my background and passion for research is about getting a lot of people who shouldn't necessarily have a say or don't usually have a say in building knowledge, getting them around the table and enabling them to kind of demystify what it means to create knowledge and creating knowledge for change and for action and not just for journals and conferences.
Yeah, and on this I will build up my question because I was wondering how do you, in order to develop such program, you need fundings?
Yes.
Meaning that you need to report and document using the Western psychiatric languages?
No, not psychiatric.
No.
No. We do, you know, I publish we use different tools, and thankfully that aspect, certainly in social sciences and applied social sciences, is changing, and that there is certainly an expectation that what we do has an impact and that it's linked to real world experiences and that it aims to transform and support change where it's necessary. So First Fund, in particular, Independent Social Research Fund, is amazing and funds very independent researchers and ideas, and is super supportive. You know, some of the work that I've just described, apart from the narratives that we've published and which are available via associations that were involved in the studies themselves, they were super, you know, the writing of it is still in process because of reasons, or pandemic, life, everything. And they're super supportive. It's not like you need to give us reports and you need to write so many papers. Also, very importantly, the little funding, we're talking about £5,000 for the first round, £10,000. And also importantly, I do like to talk about money and to talk to people about money because that's actually very important, which is a kind of, certainly in UK academia, no subject. Is it the same in Germany, that you don't talk about money, or do people talk about money more? Anyway, so all of that money, much to some dismay of my employer, went to Bosnia with many obstacles, all kinds of obstacles and further taxation on that. But it went to the researchers. It didn't go to my salary. It didn't go for that kind of work. In the first one, it funded one of our two of our research meetings in Bosnia. But the second one, the money, all of it went to fund people themselves to do the work and support the work in Bosnia.
Yeah.
So there are slowly changing practices in terms of who is supporting and funding this work. My dream is to enable people who are amazing at this type of work, but who may not have chance to become professionalized researchers, to not take the wrong, you know, the kind of middle-class white bits of professionalism, but to be able to be supported and funded to do the work that they love to do and that they're amazing doing, right? And without having to go through the BA, MA, PhD, you know, like I am part of that process, but to be honored for the knowledge that they hold and what it can contribute to our understanding of the experiences they have had. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
It does make sense.
Yeah.
I mean, I have maybe like I don't know. I'm like talking about knowledge.
Yeah.
Transfer.
We're doing all kinds of things. So one of the things that people themselves send. So firstly, we ask people what they want, and they want to be heard. So in different ways, we are trying to support that. One is kind of trying to publish their stories. Second is they want social media posts, and research ethics was very concerned about that. The official formal post, like, oh goodness, you know, and allowing people to kind of ascribe their name to their stories, which some people didn't want to, some people did, but giving that choice feels very important.
Yeah.
But they want chances to talk to each other, to meet each other, to connect with each other. And that's one good thing that the pandemic brought, that kind of those online spaces became more available. So I don't think that there is any more, thankfully, an expectation just to produce papers for academic journals,
Yeah.
that there is an expectation to promote that work in a variety of ways, crucially, hopefully, to bring some alternative, to support alternative practices which support people to do their stuff. One of the things, and if anybody wants to talk to me about MAD agriculture, I'm very keen to talk to you and how to support MAD cooperatives. So if anybody online as well, please do get in touch. I'm at Sussex, the one in social work with long, complicated surname. You can't miss me. So, we are looking at ways of trying to change this, but they are a marathon rather than a sprint. I wish they were, but kind of trying to contribute to that change going forward.
Another question about your outfit.
Yes.
Can you tell us more? Is it?
Well, this was Disruption Lab, and I love the topic, and I love the space, and I love, just talking to Lamia and getting to meet. And I have to thank Jasna for that, and I have to thank Elena for that, and Nada, who was here showing us the timings earlier, for all of their support in this. But we were given quite kind of clear instructions about the presentation, and that we may or may not use it, and my memory is appalling. So I thought if I write it that way on myself, then it can kind of speak to itself. I also am an activist and kind of socio-anarchist. So that kind of, a lot of it is presentational as well, I think. So different ways of trying to find a voice. And for women, I think in particular, we sometimes carry our politics on our bodies, and it's very important to reclaim them in all kinds of ways. And I learned that from several women who kind of use their clothing to promote what they have to say and for the messages they want to share.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah. My second question goes to Donato. Are you still here? Yeah. I would like to ask you about maybe the beginning and the history of the radical deinstitutionalization process in Trieste, because it was started in the 70s. So it means that there is already a few decades of trial, experimenting, maybe documenting, and I would like to ask you how it started and what made Trieste special enough to accept this initiative and also to maintain it, and maybe also to ask you, with the new government in Italy, is these practices maybe threatened?
Thank you very much. Many difficult questions, really. Maybe I'm not the best person to answer on how it was started, and maybe some of my colleagues are, but probably it is because it is a collective experience. This is what I found more effective. It started, however, from what I can say, from the a kind of ideology. It was ideology, of course, in the positive sense, and it was on the initiative of psychiatrists. In that sense, it was top-down. It was not a popular movement in the beginning, and it not started in Trieste, really. It started in Gorizia, that is a city near here, and I think Trieste is somehow overrepresented in this kind of history, because in reality this is an Italian history that didn't have one center. It had many centers, especially in the center and North Italy. It was really rooted in the civil rights movement and in the extreme left. I can say, yes, of course, it is extreme left. It was left of the Communist Party. it was contesting the role of the asylum as of the prison and as of many other institutions. They were contested to be social control device and not popular support or helping people. I forget the second part of the question, or did I answer to the first part at least partially?
Yes, you did. And the second part was about how made that this process was maintained so long till now in Trieste.
Okay, but one important thing to say that I didn't mention is that from ideology from the Northeast Italy and from popular support, because in the beginning it was an ideology of psychiatry. Then it became a popular movement with the support of radical left, and then it came to the parliament, and it became a national law. So in Italy, the Mental Health Act takes the name from Basaglia, that was the leader of the movement. So it became a national law, and this is the reason why no psychiatric hospital does exist in Italy. Trieste maintained a role, I can say, it was the flag, the flag of the movement, and it brings it to its latest consequences. So it try to deinstitutionalize more and more. To the third part of the question, that is the most difficult. No, I don't think the actual Italian government it's a danger to the Trieste system, but there is a political danger, of course, because like maybe I think anybody of us can see, the society in general is becoming more and more fascist and more needy for social control, regardless of the government. I think maybe in the last 20 years, this is a general process in Italy and maybe in Europe with the rising of populism and shifting to the right of every parties. So I found a danger in the evolution of society that we can come back.
I won't ask my other question to you now. I will ask a question to Lamia. I would like to ask you a little bit about those differences of terms that I heard in your talk. Trauma, PTSD, diagnosis, pain, suffering. I mean, like when I hear pain or suffering, I hear human emotion. So I can also have empathy. When I hear trauma or PTSD, it's academic, medical terms that also implies that the institution take care and provide therapy. And so I would like to maybe to hear a bit more, because you explained that there's a shift in the society of how Lebanese people see trauma. And is it because they also understand that if they talk about trauma for themselves, they are also, they should also have a system that provides for their care and healing? And of course, I would like maybe, or not of course, but I would like also maybe to hear a little bit more about how you think about using science fiction as a healing methodology.
Thank you, very nice question. So I'm not trying to speak about Lebanese people, but people who were in Lebanon when the explosion happened, because there were also Syrians, Palestinians, and many different communities, migrant workers, etc. So it's not the suffering of the Lebanese people, let's say. But so I like your question about the terms, because I'm trying to say that these terms mean many things for many different people. So trauma can mean something very particular. So if you're a patient and a psychiatrist and trying to do the symptoms, if you're a humanitarian worker trying to understand whether this person is worthy of refugee or not worthy of refugee, also trauma appears, PTSD appears. So these are categories that are clinical, but also are about, especially trauma, it's about so many things. So we use it in many different ways. And as I said, institutional definitions of trauma do not converge always with how we are using it in public discourses. And I'm interested in that. As a practitioner, I'm interested in how patients are talking about it, if they come to therapy, or how people are talking about their suffering or their pain. Yesterday, also someone was saying affliction. I mean, you can also, or malaise, or I don't know. I mean, also it's a feeling of really, feeling horrible or feeling not okay in your body. And this also opens a big question about knowledge. And so you can also term your suffering or your malaise or whatever in many different ways, not necessarily psychiatric, not necessarily to take pills. I mean, you can go and treat your body from also the pain that you are in, and it could be from a violent event. I am very much interested in science fiction. I think people in my generation who lived in the Arab Spring are interested in science fiction. And many people who have lived in similar places as well. Because it's such a dystopian moment. I think we are living in a dystopian moment in the world today. It's not just the MENA region that often is essentialized as a conflict zone, much like Eastern Europe. But today we're all living in the same sort of place of dystopic place or apocalyptic place, let's say, at least psychically, the way we psychologically feel, where the world as we know it disappears. And this is why I really love Octavia Butler, especially the parable of the talents and the parable of the sower, because it is about these moments where your entire community is over. There's only, I mean, I don't know if you read the novels, but you should, but I can't summarize it, and it's hard for me to summarize. The whole world, as she knows it, this 15-year-old girl is falling apart, and then she doesn't have time to even, what struck me about these novels is that there was no emotion, the emotions are not there, it's weird. And I thought about it, and they stayed with me so much. And I think this is one of the lessons of Octavia Butler, is how to survive, how to adapt, how it's more focused on rebuilding, on things that we are doing in everyday life, for also, as we call it, self-care. We can call it many things, but planting, community talking, many tools of survival, thinking about our grandmothers and grandparents and what they taught us, and then what they've gone through, and then how we can also use that. So it's a way to move the conversation less towards trauma, whether I am traumatized or I am not, and towards a much bigger, I think, affective, like with affect, with feel, much emotional, psychic place, where it might be something else, but I don't know what it is yet.
We will now take a few questions from the audience, here physically present or also online. Should we start by a question from online?
So what is the panel's take on the current trend of teaching resilience from your different contexts? resilience.
Teaching it. Shall I respond? No, she's laughing. Reima's laughing. I mean, I don't know what to say. Also, there's also research in the US. I mean, trauma and resilience, they're interesting things. They are also about how we suffer or how we are politically, or we're trying to sort of resist something that is bad. But they also come, they come from military science. So trauma is also a military thing about the male, so they're also very masculine things. So they're about the soldier, how the soldier has to have to overcome the fear of battle and the fear of killing other people. And also it's about how the soldier has to be resilient towards it. So what does it mean to teach resilience? It means more and more injustice. So it means you're teaching someone to live in horrible ways. And I think the critique of this entire conference would be that to attend more to the structural problems, to the war itself, rather than teach the communities how to just be resilient endlessly, expecting that, of course, there will be war. It's a bit romantic, but...
The question was to the entire panel, so I'm also curious about your thoughts.
Everything that Lamia said, basically, in brief. Yeah, yeah. I don't think I have anything meaningful to add to that, but very that.
Donato?
Me too. Yes, me too. I support Lamia interpretation of it. Really, I'm not very familiar with the concept of resilience, but if I have to say something, it will be it, definitely.
Are there any questions from the audience? Here on the back.
I'm interested to ask about art as a zone for healing and finding ways to express ourselves when we're being more and more forced, all of us, to be living in a mad world. And in art zones is a place in our current society where we have a lot of chance to act freely, potentially, and so I'm curious about in terms of, I don't like to call it therapy, but using art for healing or for expressing those very, very deep and problematic things that people have experienced.
For some people, it's very, very useful, and people have been supported of different generations to access different forms of art, from music and singing to drawing. What I showed you earlier, however, was a misuse of art to try and, because it was collected by, let's say, an unnamed international agency that works with, supranational agency that works with children, to ensure fundraising for their own activities. And it was my first encounter, which something that I idealized previously at the age of 21, where I was tasked with kind of facilitating those art workshops and working with children, and then being left with these powerful, powerful drawings, and then not necessarily going back, but just kind of doing that work on behalf of someone. It made me very, very disillusioned with that kind of work. However, the other flip side of that is that there are a range of people who support people to enjoy art. And that's something we all do. You know, I really like the point that Lamia kind of drawn to, that a lot of tools that we are calling for is not pathologizing people, period, and the experiences, but trying to find meaningful ways to support them. And how to move on. You know, for conflict context, it's about how do we meaningfully move on from those experiences. I'm a huge believer, and it's my drug of choice, art of any form, right? And for many people, they don't have access to that. So yeah, it's hugely powerful. But to say just one thing is a solution also is which I don't think is your question, but yeah, it's hugely, hugely powerful for many people.
I would like to comment on something that Donato spoke about and to ask a question also. In 1984, I spent 6 months in Trieste as a volunteer, and I was very, I read a lot about Italian psychiatric reform. I would disagree that it was top-down. I mean, this is just a comment. I mean, it was initiated by a psychiatrist and his team of people who didn't want to work in the way they were supposed to work. But there was a whole movement, democratic psychiatry, that came out of 1968 movement, and without that movement, you wouldn't have the law change and all that. So I just I felt this urge to say, I don't think it was top-down. I think it's a unique example that such change was possible only when the rest of society cared and wanted to do something about that. There is a dark side, I think, of Italian psychiatric reform, including Trieste. And the way you ended the example of the migrant, the story ended when he politely asked for medication, for antipsychotic medication, and he received it. I think that your sister, I mean, this is what I experienced there, because as I said, I volunteered there, and there's a heavy reliance of medication. And I think that makes it possible to work without the institutions. I don't want to diminish the achievement, that there is no restraint, that there is no seclusion, that there are no hospitals in northern Italy. This is not the case for the whole country. As we know, there are psychiatric hospitals. But I think the reform stopped at one point, and that was medication. So my question to you is, do you have any data about the use of medication? Is it increasing? Is it decreasing? What's going on with that? Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for correcting me. For the first point, I didn't explain it well what I was thinking, because it was I was meaning that it was top down at the beginning. You know, at the beginning of the 60s in the Gorizia Asylum. Of course, it was not possible without popular support and without political power. The point is that they gained, everybody in that movement gained political power at a certain point. So I definitely agree with you, and thank you for making it clear. On the second point, I agree. I do agree. We do use medicine. We do use a lot of medicine. I wouldn't say that we use more medicine than other cities in Italy or in Europe. Regarding data, no, we don't have data, so it's not possible to compare, which I profoundly regret. But the point is, there's no difference in this point. I don't think there is a big difference on that side. Without data, you have to rely on personal impression. I have the impression that maybe what lacks here is the super huge excess. But it's just an impression, and so it counts like any other impression. So the problem is not answered, is not taken care of. This is still an open point. So you're right on that point.
Hi, yeah, thanks to the panel. Reima, especially, thank you for the way that you handled the depiction of art, and how you handled that scene was that meant a lot to me, and I'm sure other people in the audience. Yeah, as someone with PTSD within Western culture, and having to go through the fact that I've had PTSD since I was 13 years old, and yet did not get a diagnosis until I was 31, and wasn't able to receive care until I was 39. How do we address like the epistemic injustice with diagnosis, and specifically like, the hermeneutical injustice of not having the language to be able to tell our own stories, not just outside in decolonializing psychiatry, but just fundamentally, these are tools which are fundamentally lacking within colonial psychiatry, let alone within colonizing psychiatry. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm glad if I handled it sensitively, but it feels important to share kind of depictions and experiences themselves, and finding a way to communicate about difficult experiences we have. For some people, diagnosis means a lot, and I think that we are a very broad community with many different understandings of what supports us and what heals us and what helps us live our lives, and what really oppresses us. And that, like many things that happen in our lives, they're seen and experienced very differently. And for some people, I think Jasna mentioned this as well, for some people they really find the medication helpful, some people really, really don't, and had really bad experiences, but were forced to take them and were forced to understand their experiences in a particular way. I think a lot of what we're talking about is a kind of other ways of knowing and being and supporting people. But I think the crucial part from your question is being supported to tell your story and to feel better and to carry it differently. And in all different ways of intensities and for all kinds of different experiences, we do it differently. I wore the war differently, not like this, but it was something that was really heavily on my back and influenced my life in all kinds of ways. And it took a long time and a lot of support to have it as a kind of lifelong companion. And occasionally I really have to stop reading about it, stop focusing about it, because, 3/5 of my life have been spent with it in all kinds of ways, professionally, privately, you name it. Being supported to tell one's story is part of it, and I think that people really want to have ability to tell their story and to be heard and listened to. I think we can do that with each other as a community, and that is more important than professional roles that sometimes are used to facilitate that. Because it really is about finding words and feeling better and moving on with one's life and trying to not go back to where we were beforehand, but to find a way to kind of find a way forward and find a way to continue with our lives. And there is a lot of injustice that people face along the way, and further oppression that is faced, unfortunately. But I really hope that there is that support for you, and to kind of tell your story and to be able to share it with others and to find ways of, by the way, loving the presentation also the other way.
We arrived at the end of our maybe a very, very last question by Colin. Yeah.
A very quick question. We can do everything we've done today, but the diagnostic framework needs to be decolonized, and it's something we haven't discussed, because that's the theological power of the psychiatrists. I'm just wondering how we're going to do that, because most of them, we've got the American system, we've got the European system, we've got the Russian system. And just a question quickly about how do we reformulate this really powerful system?
Do we need it? Do we really need it? Do we need, I mean, do we need... I think
it's just a question. I'm waiting for your answer. You look like you're answering me a question now.
I think that, yeah.
No, I mean, if it's a rhetorical question, it is. I think it's also what just Reima just said. It's not to rely so much on maybe to be able to have the place, the time, which no one has, to find other ways of healing and recovery, that we don't have to rely so much on the diagnostic. We don't have to rely on the hegemony of these diagnoses. But I know what I'm saying is very naive, because at least in the example of Lebanon, it is completely forced on asylum seekers, through humanitarian organizations. The book is that this is what is being done, regardless of the local expertise, the different kind of tools that have been created from other events by local practitioners. So it's really about dismantling, I don't know, imperialism, or it's about also these bigger forces that through which psychiatry travels as well with it.
Yeah, so we now arrived at the end of the panel. Yeah, I would like to thank again the three speakers of today. I think that you open, with your three different talks based on different geographies, you open the subject of what could be done another way, which other language could we use to describe what happened to people, how people feel, but also what they need, because I understood that the diagnosis is less important. What is important is like to ask the people, you say, what do you need, and is the system working for you? I also think that in the subject of decolonizing, I'm from a biological field, but I think the challenges are the same. It's also which knowledge is produced, who has the right to produce knowledges, who has the privilege to have their knowledges documented, published, accessible for the scientific, but also for the community in general. I think it's very important that, for example, like your work stay and is accessible. I also think that with the good and maybe like the still maybe less good aspect of the radical deinstitutionalization process, I think that it's a process that needs to be talked about and can be a beginning, an example for other locations. I think that in decolonizing, the question is very important to acknowledge the work that is done. And I think that there's a lot of researcher, practitioner that do a lot of work that is not known by the community. Yeah, I will hand the microphone to Elena for the last word.
So I would like to thank again all four of you, and also thank you for moderating this panel. And then, I just want to say, Reima, I hope we always get this kind of criticism from now on when we have a misunderstanding. It's great. So by the end of the day, I feel overwhelmed by all the discussions and all the topics we opened, and I would like to invite you for the second day of the conference. I will just read through the program shortly. We start tomorrow at 4:30 with the performance Sentire. Then we continue with the keynote State Violence and Mental Health with Vilda White and China Mills that were already referred many times today. Then we continue with the screening phases of an exhibition, and we will end the day with art and survivor empowerment. So that answers the question a bit deeper about the arts and mental health. And then just to say that on Sunday, just to repeat what Nada said in the beginning, we have 2 workshops. One is embodiment of exclusion, and the second one, trauma-informed design, understanding digital mental health and healing. So at the very end, I would like to remind you again about our membership card. Maybe someone will get inspired, online and offline. There it is. And say once again that it was really, really nice having you all here. I really enjoyed all the topics that we just opened today. So I truly hope to see all of you back tomorrow, online and offline as well, and to have one more day of fruitful discussions. Ciao, and have a nice evening.